Hello and welcome to my video where I'm going to show you a fun technique where we're going to create yarn floats on the front of your knitting. If you've ever knit with two colours of yarn before, for instance when knitting Fair Isle, you'll know that on the back of your knitted work you will create yarn floats. So when you're knitting with one of the two colours, then there's an unused colour, and that yarn is carried along the back of your knitting until you need it again. This creates a loose piece of yarn called a float that's connected at each end to your knitting. Now in this method I'm going to show you today, we're going to put the floats on the front of the work instead to make a design feature out of them. In order to try this technique, you'll need to be knitting with two different yarns, i.e. two individual balls of yarn. The two yarns you choose must be the same weight as each other. However, you can choose whether they are the same colour or different colours. Today I'm going to do the demonstration with two different colours, just to make it a bit clearer. So first I take the end of one ball of yarn and the end of the other ball of yarn, and I line them up like so. I then use the long tail casting on method, as that's my favourite, to cast on 30 stitches. So I make a slip knot as usual, put the needle through it and tighten, making sure that the tails of yarn are at the front. I then cast on as I normally would. However, you should try and stop the yarns from twisting up too tightly. So every now and again I drop the yarns just to untwist them. You simply treat the double strand as if it were just one single strand of yarn. Once all the stitches are cast on, we can go ahead and knit. Now because the main part of my knitting is going to be stockinette, which tends to curl at the edges, I've decided to put a garter stitch border around the outside. So to begin with, I'm going to do 6 rows of knit stitches. To knit using a double strand, you need to treat the double strand as if it were a single strand. So each stitch contains the two different colours. So you take your right hand needle up through the top 2 strands, which equals 1 stitch, and then knit as normal. Make sure you pick up 1 strand of each colour per stitch. In this case, orange and oatmeal. Okay, so now I've done a few rows of garter stitch, I'm now going to show you how to do the yarn floats. I first do 8 knit stitches, 4 of which will be the garter stitch border, and 4 of which will be the stockinette, which will be the central and main part of my pattern. I then bring the orange working yarn to the front of my work, before I then do 5 knit stitches in the oatmeal colour. I then take the orange yarn through the needles to the back of my work again, and this completes one float. You can decide how loose or tight you want this yarn float to be, so at this point you need to loosen or tighten it depending on your preference. I then did 4 knit stitches using both of the working yarns. And then I made another yarn float. So I brought the orange yarn between the needles to the front, and then I did 5 knit stitches. Before taking the orange yarn to the back of the needles again. It's likely that you'll want the yarn floats on each row to look the same. So at this point, make sure that the yarn float is as loose as the previous yarn float you did on this row. I then finished the row with 8 knit stitches. Okay, so that's one right side row completed, and now we're going to knit a wrong side row. It's perfectly possible to add more yarn floats to the front of your knitting whilst knitting the wrong side, simply by taking a strand of yarn to the back of your needles when starting the float, and then to the front of your needles again when finishing the float. All I did though was 4 knit stitches for the garter stitch border, and then I did 22 purl stitches to form the main stockinette pattern. When you reach the areas where you only knit with 1 strand of yarn in the previous row, just treat them as individual stitches. So when you knit with 2 strands on the previous row, you pick up 2 strands per stitch, and when you knit with only 1 strand on the previous row, you pick up 1 strand per stitch. And to finish, I did 4 knit stitches for the garter stitch border. So as you can see, this method is very simple and allows for a lot of creativity and variation. And here is my knitting sample after several more rows. I've added a few more yarn floats, some in the oatmeal coloured yarn this time rather than the orange, and this creates a kind of stripe effect. For most of the yarn floats, I've kept them quite tight, but not so tight that they pucker the knitting. But for the top 2, I loosened them up a bit to create a kind of U-shape float. So I really hope you've enjoyed this video, and I also really hope that you give this method a go. Thank you very much for watching.